questions, and hopefully Ros, Chris and Jan as well. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and good morning / afternoon, everyone. So I'm Dr. Neville Ellis. I am the manager of the Climate Adaptation Program for the Emergency Services sector here at, can't quite say DFES. They pay my wage. I actually work for the State Emergency Management Committee. We're embedded within DFES, but we're not DFES. It's a shade of grey. As a result of the machinery of government changes that happened a few years ago. So, yes, it's an interesting space to be part of. Now, let me just go ahead and try and share my screen here. There we go. Let's share that one. Can we see that okay? Yep.
Yeah, we've got that. Thanks, Neville. Working fine.
Excellent. All right. So let me just start with the view from my backyard and pretty much everyone's backyard in southwest WA. So this has been my view, our view now, pretty much for the last 6 months, 6.5 months straight. We've received just over 9 mils of rain over the last 6 months, and this view, this relentless blue sky is starting to kind of get on everyone's nerves a little bit. Where I live in the city of Fremantle, just down the road from me, is the last remnant stand of mature jarrah, tuart and marri trees. And as you would expect, these are trees that have been around for hundreds of years. They've endured many long, harsh summers. And yet, when I walk through that park, most of those trees are either now in distress, on their way to dying, or are dead. All the lakes around me, including Bibra Lake, are bone dry. Now, that's not entirely unusual for summer. We expect most of these lakes to dry up. The difference being this year is that conditions are so dry that grass initially grew on the evaporated lake beds, but now even that grass has died and has blown away. So it's not very pretty outside. Everything's looking quite miserable. And I think there's a certain emotion to all of this that we should be cognizant of. So a few years ago, when I was doing my PhD, I was exploring the impacts of climate change on the mental well-being of farmers out in the Western Australian wheat belt. And what they were saying to me after years of drought and this very variable weather that was happening over the course of season after season after season, they were saying that their homelands didn't make sense to them anymore. The rain didn't fall when it was supposed to. In fact, the rain just didn't come. It was getting cold at weird times of year, and they were starting to feel like strangers in their own land to a certain extent. And it was quite clear that they were also grieving for the impact it was having on their homelands as well as the lost opportunities of a future that was supposed to support them. And during my PhD, I came upon this term that beautifully summarized what farmers were feeling. And that term was solastalgia. Now, unlike nostalgia, which is a kind of like homesickness, I suppose, it's yearning for a home that you have left behind or left in time. Solastalgia is the reverse. It's a form of homesickness that occurs when your homeland is leaving you behind. And this is what we're seeing increasingly in the context of climate change. When the rain doesn't fall as it should, or when you get too much, when our beaches erode and disappear, our home places are leaving us behind, leaving us feeling solastalgic. And so I come to you today giving this presentation on Noongar Whadjuk Budja, feeling decidedly or increasingly solastalgic. I just wanted to start with this observation because I think when we work in a policy space or when we work in the science space, like I did with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, there's a tendency to think about climate change in very broad, abstract terms. There's something that affects people elsewhere or in a future time. But the reality of the situation is that we're all engulfed by this problem, and increasingly we are being personally affected by it, and it affects our emotions as well. Now, I think it's important to start with this everyday context to ground climate change in just our everyday way of living. And what this means is that just like in the pandemic, really we are all in this all together. And it also means that whatever we can do to address the root causes of climate change or to address the harms arising from climate change is a good thing. Now, on that very happy, very positive introduction, let me give a little overview of what I intend to present today. So to begin with, I'll provide a bit of an overview of emergency management in WA, because emergency management does look slightly different between each of our jurisdictions in Australia. I'll talk a little bit about climate change in WA and some of the impacts we're seeing to date. I'll then get into the nuts and bolts of the emergency management sector adaptation plan, which we're developing. I also want to talk about some of the conceptual challenges that are being thrown up by climate change, and how this is forcing us to think differently about the concept of risk in emergency management. Coming from an academic background, it's these conceptual challenges that really intrigue me, and hopefully they will intrigue you too. And then I'll close with talking about next steps with this project. So just to begin with, let me provide some background to emergency management here in WA. So ours is a very large, very diverse sector. There are at least 170 organisations that are written into our state emergency management framework, so outlining specific roles and responsibilities. And these range from very small, very remote local governments through to philanthropic and NGO actors, through to large state government agencies. Together, the sector manages 27, soon to be 28, prescribed hazards across the prevention, preparedness, response and recovery phases of emergency management. These range from your more bread and butter sort of hazards like bushfire or cyclone, through to more bespoke, let's say, hazards such as space debris re-entry and radiation leak from nuclear-powered warships. That latter one might become more prominent as a result of the AUKUS deal, but let's hope not too. Now, obviously, a major challenge for us in WA is our geography. Our emergency management sector operates over the largest jurisdiction anywhere in the world. And of course, this poses a whole range of challenges for us, notably having to manage emergencies in often very remote locations, and also having to manage concurrent emergencies. So often when there's floods happening up north, we're also having to deal with bushfires down south. Now, sitting atop the emergency management sector here in WA is our State Emergency Management Committee. It's comprised of leaders from large state agencies, from peak bodies, and others as well. There's been a bit of change at the top of the State Emergency Management Committee. Women play a very significant role in this committee. Our chair, Emma Cole, was recently appointed as the chair only a few months ago, and we have a new executive officer, Deputy Commissioner Melissa Pexton, who's Deputy Commissioner here at DFES.
Just to give you some background, Melissa's been a huge supporter of the Your Network, and she's one on our advisory group, and she was one of our sort of originating friends who encouraged us to move forward. So you're very lucky that you have her.
Oh, I did not know that actually. Thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, DC Pexton is phenomenal, and we love working with her very much. So the SEMC is responsible for providing both the strategic direction for emergency management in WA, but also providing oversight to ensure that we have appropriate capabilities and arrangements in place. The SEMC is supported by a committee structure that ranges from state, district and local levels, as well as a range of subcommittees as well, including the relatively recently established climate change subcommittee. But I'll circle back to talk about that committee in a little bit. Now, in terms of climate change in WA, As we know, climate change occurs because we're releasing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Greenhouse gases accumulate in the atmosphere, preventing radiative energy from bouncing back out into space, thus creating this greenhouse effect. It's having different impacts throughout different parts of the world, but many of the impacts you can see here are probably analogous to what you're experiencing in your part of Australia and New Zealand as well. So what we've observed over the last century has been about this 1.3 degree increase in average temperatures. It's probably higher now. This is data that came out about 10 years ago, so it is a little bit old now. We've seen a 20% reduction in winter rainfall throughout the southwest, including Perth, which we're clearly experiencing at the minute. We've seen a significant uptick in severe heatwave conditions. And again, that came to the forefront earlier this year in Perth, where we had 4 40-degree plus heat waves back to back over a 4-week period. We've also seen a significant uptick in the number of days with severe fire weather conditions as well. And of course, we've seen this increase in sea level rise across our coastline as well. Now, unsurprisingly, all the projections are telling us that these trends are likely to deepen and worsen into the future. Now, of course, this means that we're seeing an increase in disaster events, both here in Western Australia, of course, nationally, and of course, globally as well. On the right-hand side there, you can see a timeline of some of the emergency events that we've had to deal with here in WA over the last 10 years or so. The specifics aren't really that important. The important thing to see here is that we are now having these large-scale complex events happening relatively frequently, meaning that there is less time to recover before the next one hits. And then many times the recovery effort leads into the next emergency event, meaning that communities and state agencies just don't have time to regroup and recover before the next one hits. Of course, as a result of that, we're seeing disaster costs on the rise. A recent report by Deloitte suggests that the cumulative cost of weather-related disasters in Western Australia alone between 2020 and 2060 could reach $120 billion. And we're also seeing an uptick in the demand for emergency services and emergency management agencies to address the risks posed by climate change. Now, recognising all of this, the SEMC identified climate change as a strategic priority for its strategic plan a few years back and moved to create the Climate Change Subcommittee in October 2022. The overarching goal of this committee is to drive adaptation and risk reduction strategies in a cohesive manner across the sector. Now, it's also interesting that at the same time that the subcommittee was established, the state government was rapidly pursuing its own climate change agenda. And we can see that through the release of the Western Australian Climate Adaptation Strategy, which was released in July last year, which sets the strategic direction for adaptation in our state, as well as the introduction of the Climate Change Bill into Parliament in November last year as well. I'll talk about those in a little bit further detail as we go on. Now, when we're talking about tackling climate change, really there's 2 broad areas of focus here in Western Australia and indeed globally. The first strand of action is mitigation. So these are actions that we take to reduce the root causes of climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. There's a whole raft of work happening in WA at the moment, but that isn't our focus for today's presentation. Instead, I want to focus on adaptation, which on the right-hand side here is the process of adjusting and moderating harm from climate risks and exploiting benefits. Again, there's a whole raft of work that is starting to come online here in WA, but the one that I want to talk about specifically are these sector adaptation plans. So the Climate Change Bill, which was introduced to the WA Parliament in November last year, requires prescribed sectors to develop these sector adaptation plans. So prescribed sectors include ours in emergency management, the health sector, primary industry, and a few others as well. And the purpose of these SAPs are to support and accelerate climate change adaptation within specific sectors in alignment with the WA Climate Adaptation Strategy. Now, given that the SEMC, the State Emergency Management Committee, had already developed a climate change subcommittee and was already starting to do this work, it's unsurprising that the SEMC was put forward as the lead agency for developing the Emergency Management Sector Adaptation Plan, or the MSAP. It's also important to recognise that that we in emergency management, and as well as the health sectors, are the first cabs off the rank in developing these SAPs. So we're learning a lot, or doing a lot of the mistakes and learning as we go that hopefully will inform the development of the other SAPs going forward. And I think the cartoon on the right-hand side sort of summarises the process thus far. So, you know, been good fun, let's say. So to help with the development of the MSAP, we released a discussion paper which went out for broad consultation with the sector late last year. In it, what we were trying to think through was two main things. First, we were trying to think through how do we embed adaptation in our existing structures in emergency management. The last thing we want to do is create an additional layer of bureaucracy or an additional reporting stream. We want to be able to embed it in everything that we do. And number two, we'll want to ensure that adaptation is aligned with our existing emergency management priorities, objectives, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Again, we are trying to streamline adaptation in everything that we do. The discussion paper had three main bits of content, I suppose. Number one, we proposed a number of sector specific adaptation priorities and objectives. Number two, we proposed a reporting structure for adaptation from local, district to state level. And three, we sought organisations to self-nominate as either a lead or support organisation to drive those actions forward. Now, before I go any further, it's important to note that the consultation period just closed about a week ago. We're still getting submissions in now. So it's a little bit premature to talk about emerging themes or feedback from the sector at this stage. So that could be a conversation for further down the line. I'd be very happy to come back and share with the group what we've learned. In terms of the structure of the MSAP, I just want to spend a couple of minutes talking about how we are proposing to align what we do in emergency management with the overarching legislative and strategic environment, let's say. So let's get our wonky policy hats on for a couple of minutes. On the right-hand side up the top, this is our authorising environment for climate change and emergency management. It outlines legislation, policy, and strategy for both areas of work. And as you can see, it's quite a crowded space, right? We've had the climate change legislation, which was introduced to Parliament late last year. We had the climate change policy, which is only a couple of years old, and this climate adaptation strategy, which is only 7 or 8 months old, right? And then we've got the emergency management stuff on the right-hand side here, which is very, very large, very involved, okay? But together, this provides the environment that we're operating within, I suppose. Now, a key point here is the climate adaptation strategy, which of course outlines the strategic priorities for the state government when it comes to climate change adaptation. And within the climate adaptation strategy, they outline 4 key directions. The first one is produce and communicate credible climate information and resources. Number 2 is build public sector climate capability and strengthen accountability. Number 3 is enhance sector-wide and community partnerships to unite and coordinate action. So bringing more people into the fold of government, I suppose, and within our structures. And 2, empowering and supporting the climate resilience of Aboriginal people. which is particularly important because we know that Indigenous people, Aboriginal people, are particularly vulnerable and at risk to the effects of a changing climate. So what we attempted to do with the discussion paper is identify a number of high-level objectives and sector-specific actions that then align to the 4 key directions to ensure that what we are doing in our sector is indeed aligned with state-level priorities, and also to ensure a transparent process as well. We also propose a reporting structure for adaptation in the MSAP. So the specifics aren't that important. Basically, what we're trying to think through is how can we ensure visibility at a state level over all of the fantastic adaptation work that's happening at local, district and state level, so then we can report up to our minister and then across over into Parliament as well. So there are mechanisms, there are structures within our state emergency management framework that enable reporting for emergency management. And what we're trying to think through is how do we piggyback onto those structures to include adaptation as well. So again, so we don't have a separate reporting stream. So now that I've talked about some of the policy and the structure of all of this, I want to talk about what exactly is adaptation and what does it mean for us here in emergency management. As I said from the outset, climate change is challenging the way that we think about risk within our emergency management context. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about this because I think it's quite important for how we frame the problem of climate change and frame adaptation as well. So for the last number of decades, I don't know, 50 years or so, this is the way that we have been thinking about risk. In emergency management, we tend to think about risk as being located at the center of a Venn diagram of hazard, the event, thing that could potentially cause harm, exposure, all those things that are in the way that might be harmed, and vulnerability, those things that will be harmed by the hazard. Now, it's worth noting that in emergency management, most of our focus historically has been on the hazard itself. We have dedicated a lot of resources to understanding different hazards, such as bushfire, flood, cyclones, et cetera. We're very good at detecting them early, and that's supported by a vast remote sensing infrastructure and satellite infrastructure. We can track tropical lows thousands of kilometers off the coast, for example. And I've got to say, we are starting to get better, at least here in WA. I don't know about other jurisdictions, but we are getting better at understanding our exposures as well, particularly exposures in the built environment. What we're not very good at, however, is understanding or addressing the root causes of vulnerability, particularly these social and cultural drivers of vulnerability. I'll come back to that in a second. Now, it's worth noting that this traditional model of risk works very well in the context of isolated and relatively easily definable emergency events. Right? So take bushfire, for example. We know what a bushfire is. For the most part, we know where it's likely to occur. It's a phenomenon that has a clear beginning, middle, and end. And for the most part, we know how to manage this risk, right? Now, things get much trickier when we try to apply this model in more complex contexts. So, for example, in the context of concurrent and cascading events, hazard, exposure, and vulnerability start to blur into one another to the point where we're having to use extraordinary measures within our framework to define the problem that we're trying to manage in the first place and to prioritize our actions. It also breaks down in the face of climate change and other large-scale drivers of risk. This is because climate change is not a specific hazard. It's not like bushfire, it's not like a cyclone. Rather, climate change affects how hazards behave. It creates its own exposures and vulnerabilities, and it interacts with itself and other social and economic and cultural drivers to create this really wicked and very intractable set of problems. And we're only just starting to realize this within emergency management. And as such, I think we're at the beginning, we're starting to take a baby step into a new paradigm, a new way of thinking about risk. And I want to spend a few minutes talking to you about what this kind of looks like. Now, when you look at the literature that's come out over the last few years, a step change is unfolding in the way that we think about risk. It seems as though no matter which way we look, systemic risk, not hazard-specific risk, systemic risk is now a central pillar of disaster risk reduction policy, strategy, and research. However, despite this, and despite the growing body of work that's happening in the systemic risk space, there is a yawning gap between the theory and the principles of systemic risk and its practical application. And this is a problem because many of the risks that we have to manage today, including climate change, are systemic in nature. Now, to reinforce this point, this is a graphic that was produced by the Global Assessment Report for Disaster Risk Reduction back in 2019. What it shows is the evolution of how we think about risk at an international policy level. What we can see is that from the 50s through to kind of present day, this hazard-based approach has been the dominant way of thinking about risk. But importantly, the authors show in this diagram that today we are transitioning to this more systemic risk management approach. And also importantly, the authors are predicting that this will be the dominant approach moving forward. Okay. So that begs the question, what exactly are these systemic risks? How do we understand systemic risk? Well, the main way that we think about systemic risk in emergency management today is in terms of these compounding cascading risks, right? So these are risks that have the potential to spread from one sector to another or from one community to another, like a set of dominoes falling, right? This is the main way that we engage with systemic risks today, but it's not the only definition. We can also ask other questions about systemic risks, such as what are the underlying conditions that give rise to risk in the first place, right? And this is where we have to talk about systemic vulnerabilities. So take this Jenga tower on the right-hand side, for example. Many of its supports have been knocked out by these underlying drivers of risk that are operating over different timescales and different scales, right? Whether it's declining trust in institutions or demographic shift or turbulent geopolitical conditions, right? They're knocking out the supports of that structure and making that structure more vulnerable, more susceptible to toppling over. And the takeaway here is that the more vulnerable a society becomes, the more susceptible it is to being harmed, even by relatively small events. This is a part of systemic risk that we're only just starting to understand. The other thing we're starting to understand is that systemic risks are deeply uncertain. The future will not look the same as the past. And this is because many of the underlying drivers affecting our world today, whether it's rapid technological change or economic instability, are creating impacts that are pretty much impossible to predict in advance. So, for example, in November 2019, if you told people here that we would be dealing with a catastrophic cyclone event and a catastrophic bushfire event only 6 weeks later, and all of this would be happening in the context of a global pandemic, and there would be war in Europe, they would have laughed you out of the building, right? The future is inherently unpredictable and uncertain. And that means that the overarching objectives of emergency management must evolve. On the one hand, we still have to manage specific hazards, But also, on the other hand, we have to be able to manage for this deepening uncertainty. And of course, the final implication of these systemic risks is that it is fundamentally challenging our traditional hazard by hazard approaches to emergency risk management. We are being pushed and pulled towards a more systemic risk management approach. Now, we have tried to capture some of this thinking within our discussion paper, okay? In the MSAP discussion paper, we recognise that climate change is destabilising this hazard by hazard approach. We recognise climate change as a systemic driver of risk. And importantly, we also recognise that although adaptation and emergency risk management overlap, they both are focused on reducing risk, they are actually imply very different objectives. Adaptation implies preparing for or building general resilience for managing deepening uncertainty. It also implies that we need new methodologies to be able to probe these underlying systemic drivers of risk and systemic vulnerabilities. Standard risk assessment methods don't work in this context. And we can see that with the recent review of the National Emergency Risk Management Guidelines, the NERAG. They're now kind of redundant in this systemic risk context. And it also makes clear that if we're going to do adaptation well, then we need to move outside of our disciplinary silos and agency silos to be able to work together in a better and more coordinated way. And the take-home message from all of this too is that the need for deep adaptation is only going to increase as climate change worsens into the future. So given all that, what are the major implications for our sector moving forward? Well, number one, it's clear that our jurisdiction, and in fact, most emergency management jurisdictions across the world, I would say, are under increasing pressure to adopt this systemic risk management approach. And this pressure is coming from our experience of real-world events. It's coming from policy reviews, such as policy advances, I should say, such as the recently released second National Action Plan for Disaster Risk Reduction, where systemic risk is identified as a key priority. It's coming through major reviews, such as the Royal Commission and the Glasser Report. However, as stated up front, there remains this gulf between the theory of systemic risk and its practical application. And this is where the MSAP will come in to hopefully start to fill some of these gaps. Number two, it's also clear that given that there's an increasing amount of work happening in this space, there's going to be greater need to be able to align this work within some sort of strategic framework and under some sort of common and conceptual umbrella. Now, I think here there's some really interesting conversations being undertaken by the State Emergency Management Committee around this concept of systemic risk and where exactly does it fit within our arrangements. And number three, the last major implication, I think, for us is that although systemic risk is the bright, shiny object, I suppose, for emergency management at the moment, this hazard by hazard approach will continue to be fundamental to what we do. However, what we're recognizing is that there's two streams of work emerging. One will focus on the hazard by hazard approach, and the other one will focus more on the systemic risk management approach. And we're trying to understand what does this mean for our emergency management arrangements moving forward, particularly in the context of prevention and preparedness. Now, in terms of next steps for us, well, as I said, the consultation on the discussion paper just closed. So in the weeks to come, I'll be sifting through that feedback, making sense of it, and developing a revised draft of the MSAP. We also know that we have to develop a more comprehensive risk assessment for the sector. And that's a bit of a vexed question because, as I said, traditional methods for assessing risk are increasingly redundant within this systemic risk context. So there are conversations that need to be had around this, both with stakeholders here in WA, but also with our national stakeholders, including NEMA. We also need to work with our Department of Water and Environmental Regulation to ensure that we are meeting our legislative requirements. it's important to note that even though the bill was introduced, our climate change bill was introduced in November last year, we're expecting it to become enacted in the middle of this year. So there might be some changes along the way. So we need to be cognizant of that. And we're also cognizant of the work that's happening at a national level through the National Climate Risk Assessment and National Adaptation Plan, which is forthcoming. So we need to also understand how our work aligns with those bodies of work as well. So yeah, it's very exciting times. I think we're in a period of flux, I would say, here in WA, and I think nationally as well. We're recognizing that we're entering a new terrain, and we need to do things differently if we are going to be serious about adapting to a changing climate. Now, that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your time today. I'll stop sharing my screen, hopefully, and very happy to take any questions that you might have.
Awesome. Thank you. Now, well, that was way more than I had expected and hoped for. That was a really brilliant journey through disaster risk reduction over the years. So thank you so much for bringing that in. I've been chucking some questions in the chat box, and Chris has got one in there as well, and everyone's come on the screen now, which is fantastic. So I will let others go first. If you want to, Chris, if you want to say out loud your question, or Jan or Roz, if you want to jump in as well.
That's fine, Amanda. Yes, I was just making a note about how are we going to manage living in a state of permacrisis or polycrisis when we're getting so many hits coming simultaneously. And as I mentioned to Amanda a few years ago, I was at FEMA's academy, training academy, with a whole lot of senior managers. This is 2006. And even then we were talking about something's happening, something is changing. We aren't climate change experts. We're just the people at the bottom of the cliff trying to deal with things when it all goes badly wrong. But between us, we probably had hundreds of years of experience if you added it all up. And even then, in 2006, we could see the writing on the wall. We could see that we were getting bigger hits and more frequently. And it looks like they're all joining up now. So how does your plan fit in with that?
It comes back to this idea of differentiating between specific resilience and general resilience, I think. So we're very good at building capability and resilience for specific hazards like bushfire, cyclone, et cetera, et cetera. Interestingly enough, I think the State Emergency Management Committee over here is also increasingly getting better at building general resilience as well, but we just don't use that term yet. So what we've seen over the last couple of years is that the State Emergency Management Committee is undertaking these programs of work to expand participation within emergency management, to improve connectivity between actors and organisations within our sector, and also to improve the way in which we anticipate and learn as well. And the important takeaway from these actions is that they're not hazard specific, right? Together, these bodies of work help you to manage whatever event comes your way, and they're the sorts of capabilities that we need to be able to invest in and develop further going forward. I think there's a real opportunity for our State Emergency Management Committee to start using the language of general resilience and systemic risk to start framing these bodies of work in a more explicit sort of way to ensure that these rather discrete bodies of work are all joined up and pointing in the same direction. So I think that's probably where we're heading in the next few years. But you know, inevitably we're already hitting limits to adaptation in some arenas, and without very strong work to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, then you know, these sorts of conversations become a bit of a moot point, really.
Wow, that's a really profound statement, right? Just letting that sink in. Hitting the limits of our adaptation capability. That's
well, I mean, there's these limits. Unfortunately, we don't really. I mean, if you look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, right, they talk about limits to adaptation. The problem is with these limits, you only ever know about them once you've crossed them.
Exactly right. Exactly right. So that's, I mean, and it's a good comment to reflect on. Often people talk about adaptation, not enough about mitigation. So I love the way that you just said that as well. It's like we're going to run out of adaptation possibilities. So we need to continue to fight with our mitigation strategies as well alongside and not forget them.
Well, it's worth noting that as at an international level, as these limits to adaptation became increasingly clear, or the fact that we're going to run into them at some point, at an international level, a third pillar of work emerged. So you've got mitigation, adaptation, and the third pillar is loss and damage, right? So when you exceed the limits of adaptation, you will end up with damage and you will end up with loss. And then the question is, what do you do about that?
And it won't be.
That's a conversation for another day, though.
Yeah, it is. And it won't be equally shared. Look, I just, yeah, go ahead, Jan.
How do you see the political will in WA for embracing these strategies, Neville, and committing with actual money to fund, you know, some of the work that needs to be done in that adaptation and mitigation space to then offset that inevitable cost to government if, you know, we get to the point where loss is the only kind of outcome?
I don't talk about mitigation so much because I don't know enough about it, and some of it is politically contentious given the nature of our economy over here, obviously very resource based. Adaptation, there's a lot of commitment to adaptation. So unlike Amanda, like you were saying, some people joined this forum to be able to speak freely and openly about climate change. Everyone over here is talking about climate change. Climate change is the buzz term across most of the state agencies that I work with. People are taking it very, very seriously. State agencies themselves are committing resources and money to adapt in their own ways, to be able to meet their own legislative responsibilities. But the state government is also supporting bespoke adaptation programs as well through the Department of Water and Environmental Regulation. Now, are they huge buckets of money? They're not massive, but compared to where we were even 5 years ago, it's night and day, the difference, I think. So it's exciting. It's exciting times. So when you do talk to the people at Department of Water and Environmental Regulation have been working in this space for decades, they're like kids in a candy shop. They're so excited. They're exhausted because the amount of work they have to do, but they're so excited. So yeah, it's
and do you think
time
that
to be working climate change here.
Piece can work without the mitigation? You know, you said there's a bit of stigma against that in WA.
It's not so much stigma. It's you know, again, I don't know enough about the detail around mitigation policy here to be able to confidently say. Work is underway, but we don't have a mitigation target.
Do you have a mitigation plan or a strategy for the state, or?
Well, it's a fair bit of the climate change bill. Most of it is dedicated to mitigation. Only a small part of it really is dedicated to adaptation, right? So it's mostly through legislative structures. But again, there's a separate body of work that's happening at a state and agency level that I'm not really across. So I can't really say with any confidence.
Thank you.
I just wanted to know, we'll have to wrap up. I've just been advised that there's another OR meeting happening on this channel soon, but I'm going to just indulge myself and go over. I just wanted to know, if you can quickly, how you are bringing community along and what role the community and the public have to play in these adaptation plans, or whether you're just seeing this specifically as what the emergency management sector is going to do.
Yeah, it's a good question. There's two parts to that answer. One, through the emergency management sector adaptation plan specifically, our main avenue to engage in communities is through our local governments and through their local emergency management arrangements, right? So augmenting those arrangements to ensure that climate change risks are being recognised and that adaptation is baked into the arrangements. But at a much broader level, in terms of State Emergency Management Committee and their strategy, there are movements afoot to be able to better engage with the community around these questions of preparedness and resilience. And for instance, we saw the recent release of the Community Disaster Resilience Strategy, for example, which provides a high-level strategy for developing community resilience across the state. That's become the bedrock for one of our subcommittees, the Community Resilience and Recovery Subcommittee, and their work plan as well. We know we've got a lot more work to do in this space, but I think we are